She came home to find her world on fire, and a stranger, a man she had never seen before, was already running into the flames. He saved her family. He stayed to help rebuild. He made her believe, for the first time in years, that a man could be exactly what he appeared to be. He was not. His real name was not what he told her. His reason for being on that road was not what he claimed. And the truth, when it finally came, would cost her everything she had just begun to trust. But here is the question that will stay with you long after this story ends. When a man comes to you as your enemy and chooses, at the moment it costs him the most, to become something else, what do you call that? This channel is where the dust never quite settles stories of the American West, of love earned the hard way, of mothers who held families together with bare hands, and strangers who became everything. If you believe that the most human moments happen in the hardest places, you are in the right place. The people who are worth trusting are not the ones who never failed you. They are the ones who, when the moment came, chose you anyway. If this story is already living in your chest, hit like so more people find it. Leave me a comment. I read every single one. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because next week's story is already waiting for you.
People in Redemption Creek still talk about the night the Calloway place burned. They talk about the stranger who rode out of the dark and pulled my family from the flames one by one. What they don't talk about, what I didn't know until it was almost too late, is who that stranger really was, or why he was on that road to begin with. My name is Eliza Calloway. I was 24 years old the summer everything I owned turned to ash, and everything I thought I understood about people turned out to be wrong. This is the story of how I lost my home, nearly lost my land, and found something I hadn't known I was looking for. It starts on a Thursday evening in July of 1879, on a dirt road 4 miles outside Redemption Creek, Texas, with my hands shaking inside my gloves, and a debt notice folded in my coat pocket that felt heavier than the saddle under me. Raymond Whitfield had been polite about it. That was the worst part. He'd sat behind his mahogany desk in that cool stone office of his and laid out the numbers in a tone of voice a man uses when he is performing generosity while conducting demolition. 60 days to settle the debt in full. The note my father had signed 4 years ago, before he disappeared, had been accruing interest at terms I was only now beginning to understand. The total was not survivable on what our cattle and crops could produce. I rode home calculating numbers that didn't add up no matter how I arranged them. Half a mile from the house, I saw the glow above the tree line. I don't remember dismounting. I only remember running, screaming names into smoke that tasted like everything I owned. May, Ruth, Thomas, all 3 of my siblings still inside. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles east. The town was 4 miles west, and the sun was already gone. I was still screaming when I heard the hoofbeats. A black horse came out of the dark at a full run. The rider pulled up hard, scanned the burning structure in the space of 2 seconds, then looked at me once. His voice was low and steady, in a way that had no business existing inside this much chaos. Eliza said, "How many inside?" 3, I said. My brother and sisters. He was already moving before I finished the sentence. He made 3 trips into the burning house. Ruth, first, carried over his shoulder and coughing so hard she couldn't stand. Thomas, second, unconscious, small face tucked against the stranger's chest. May, third, from the back room where the smoke was worst, where the ceiling had started to drop. He came out with her slung across his arms, and the porch roof came down behind them. He threw himself over her as they hit the ground. When he stood up, his shirt was dark and wet across the back. I got to him first. "Are they breathing?" I said. "Tell me they're all breathing." "They're breathing," he said. "All 3. The firelight caught his face for the first time. Strong jaw, dark hair matted with sweat, eyes the color of a winter sky. Gray and blue and very steady. He pulled a bandana down from his face and looked at the burning house the way a man looks at something he's already accepted losing. He didn't leave. That was the first thing that surprised me. He unsaddled his black horse at a safe distance from the fire, built a small camp near the creek, and produced coffee and jerky from his saddlebags with the efficiency of a man accustomed to managing difficult situations alone. He tended my siblings without being asked, checking their breathing, covering them with his bedroll, telling Thomas a quiet story when the boy woke up frightened and disoriented. I sat at the edge of the firelight and watched him, and I thought about the fact that nobody just happens to be on that road at that hour. "What's your name?" I asked him, when the younger ones were finally asleep. "Cole," he said. "Cole McAllister. Where were you headed, Mr. McAllister?" "Silver Ridge Ranch," he said, "looking for work." He said it without looking away from the fire. It was a reasonable answer. I noted that reasonable answers and true answers were not always the same category. In the morning, I offered him 30 days of work in exchange for meals and a place to sleep in the barn. We needed hands to help with the rebuilding, and I couldn't afford to pay wages. He accepted without negotiating, which should have reassured me. It did not. The daylight was merciless. I walked the ruins of the house at first light and made myself look at all of it. The stone chimney standing over the charred remains like a marker, the collapsed roof, my mother's rocking chair reduced to a blackened frame. The barn had survived. The tools were there. The herd was intact. I had 3 frightened siblings, a stranger sleeping in the barn, 60 days to pay a debt I couldn't pay, and exactly 0 time for grief. By the end of the first day, I had begun to wonder about Cole McAllister. He moved through the property with a familiarity that didn't fit his story. He knew which fence posts were load-bearing before testing them. He knew the water table ran shallow on the west side without being told. He walked the property line without asking where it was and stopped at the right places without looking at a map. Ruth noticed before I said anything. She was 14 and noticed most things. Ruth said, "How does a drifter know which corner posts are structural?" I said, "He's experienced." Ruth said, "He knew the property line ran to the creek before you told him." She paused. I didn't tell him either. I had no answer for that. I filed it alongside the question of why he had been on that road at that hour, in a growing collection of things about Cole McAllister that didn't quite fit together. On the 3rd morning, Douglas Hale arrived with flowers. I had known Douglas was coming. Douglas always came when he sensed vulnerability, dressed it up as concern, and presented it as generosity. He had been my fiancé for 4 months, 2 years prior, before I understood that what he wanted was the land my family sat on. He was Raymond Whitfield's son from his first marriage, polished and pleasant, and about as trustworthy as a rattlesnake in good weather. He stood on what remained of our porch and performed sympathy for May and Thomas, who were too young and too shaken to see through it. He expressed his condolences. He looked out over the property with eyes that were calculating square footage. Then his gaze found Cole across the yard. Something happened in that moment. A flicker, barely a second, and then Douglas's expression smoothed over and he looked away. Cole had already looked away first. The exchange was so quick I might have imagined it, but I had grown up watching men hide things behind good manners, and I had learned to trust what I saw in the fraction of a second before the hiding started. Douglas left. Cole went back to work. I said nothing to either of them. That evening, I brought Cole's supper out to the barn. We talked the way 2 people talk when they are both withholding things, carefully, with long pauses that had weight to them. Cole asked about the debt situation with a specificity that stopped me mid-sentence. He said, "Whitfield set the terms on the original note, or was there an intermediary?" I set down my coffee cup. I said, "How do you know Whitfield's name?" I didn't mention him. Cole said, "Heard it in town. Man like that, his name travels." It was a reasonable answer. I did not believe it. I picked up my cup and finished my coffee and went back to the house, and I sat at the kitchen table with my father's ledger open in front of me, and I thought about all the reasonable answers I had been given in my life by men who were standing in the wrong place for the reasons they claimed. The last entry in my father's handwriting, Whitfield note extended. Terms to be discussed. He'd written it 18 months before he left, before he put on his coat on a winter evening and walked out the door and didn't come back, before I became the person responsible for 3 younger children, a working ranch, and a debt I hadn't known existed. I closed the ledger, From the window I could see the small light in the barn where Cole was still awake. I watched it for longer than I should have. Then I went to bed and tried to sleep and did not succeed. 2 days later, something happened that I later understood was the beginning of everything. I was passing the corral in the late afternoon when reckoning. Cole's black horse, a difficult animal who tolerated no one and had nearly taken a finger off one of the Patterson boys the previous week, walked to the fence rail and dropped his head into my hand. I went completely still. I did not fully understand what had just happened. Cole was across the yard, and I felt him go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. I didn't look at him. I stood there with my hand on that horse's nose and thought about what it means when a creature that trusts no one decides, without apparent reason, to trust you. I thought about it for a long time afterward. Market day in Redemption Creek was the first Friday of the month, and I needed it to go well. We had 3 steers to sell, enough to cover 1 payment toward the debt if the price held. Cole drove the wagon. The town watched us arrive with the particular attention small towns reserve for any change in a familiar story. A strange man working the Callaway land was news worth watching. Raymond Whitfield was on the main street when we arrived. He was moving through the crowd near the feed store, speaking with the easy authority of a man who owns enough of a town that the town has stopped noticing. I saw him from half a block away. Then I watched Cole see him. It happened fast. Cole's hands tightened on the reins. His face went the color of old ash. He looked at Whitfield the way a man looks at something he has been outrunning for a long time and has suddenly found standing in front of him. Then he pulled his hat lower and looked away. I said, "What just happened to you?" Cole said, "Bad memory. Let's move." That evening, Maggie Dunmore pulled me into the boarding house under the pretext of coffee. Maggie ran the only boarding house in Redemption Creek and knew more about the town's actual business than anyone who had ever sat in the sheriff's office or the bank. Her husband had died 3 years before. She had been watching the world carefully ever since. Maggie said, "That man you've got working your land." I said, "He's not my man." Maggie said, "I know that. I'm saying he looked at Raymond Whitfield the way a man looks at something he's been trying to outrun." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I've seen that look before. It worries me on your behalf." I told her I appreciated the concern. I did not tell her it confirmed something I had already suspected. The storm came the following Tuesday. Fast-moving and sudden the way Texas storms are, with no apology and no warning. It caught Cole and me inside the barn while we were repairing the roof, and there was no dignified exit available. The space was 6 feet wide, and the rain on the tin roof was loud enough to make conversation a commitment. Cole talked about his mother. She was the only person from his past he mentioned without guardedness, a woman who had made a home out of difficult circumstances and died when he was 20 and left a hole in the shape of home-shaped things that he hadn't known how to fill since. I talked about the school I wanted to build. 1 room, a wood stove, books collected from wherever I could find them, children who lived too far from town to attend regularly, learning to read in a place that was theirs. Cole looked at me across the dim space of the barn and said, "You'd be a hell of a teacher, Eliza Callaway. The kind that changes the direction of a life without the student ever knowing it happened." No one had ever said that to me. I had no available response, so I said nothing, and the rain kept coming, and neither of us moved toward the other. When the storm began to ease, Cole stood up and put deliberate distance between himself and where I was sitting, like a man who knows exactly how much damage staying close would do. I filed that away with everything else. Ruth found the map on a Wednesday afternoon. She had gone into Cole's saddlebag looking for a bridle and found instead a hand-drawn rendering of our property. Detailed, accurate, recent ink. The north section, a rocky quarter-mile that seemed useless, and that Whitfield had mentioned twice in passing, was circled in red. She brought it to me without a word and set it on the kitchen table. I looked at it for a long time. The next morning, I went to the bookstore in town for a reader I was using to supplement Ruth's lessons. Cole was already there. The store was 12 feet across, and there was no dignified way to pretend he wasn't present. We didn't speak for what felt like a considerable amount of time. Then Cole took a book from the shelf and set it on the counter before I could reach the counter myself. McGuffey's Eclectic Reader, the one I had been saving toward for 4 months. He paid before I could object. He didn't hand it to me. He left it on the counter and walked out. That evening I opened the front cover, his handwriting inside. For the school you will build and the teacher you already are. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I told myself this approximately 4 times on the walk home. I was not convincing on any of the 4 attempts. That night I heard Cole's saddle reckoning at 2 in the morning. I watched from the window as he rode to the north fence line and stood there in the dark, looking at the land the way a man looks at something he is taking inventory of, or like a man working out how to say goodbye to something he has already decided he cannot take. I did not sleep after that. Ruth set the map on the kitchen table the next morning without preamble. I had already been awake for 2 hours. I looked at the map. I looked at the red circle over the north section. I thought about the way Cole had reacted to Raymond Whitfield on the main street of Redemption Creek. Then I thought about the scar. 3 nights prior, Cole had been working at the forge when a coal popped and caught his forearm. I'd cleaned and wrapped it in the barn afterward, and when he'd taken his shirt off to let me check the burn on his back from the first fire while still healing, still angry, I had seen on his left shoulder a brand mark. The letter W, large and deliberate, worked over afterward with scar tissue in a way that suggested someone had tried with considerable pain to erase it. I had not asked, he had not offered. I picked up the map and went to find him. He was at the north fence line, the exact section circled in red. He had his back to me, but he heard me coming and didn't turn around, which told me he had been expecting this. I set the map on the fence post between us. He looked at it. He didn't deny it. The silence stretched long enough that I understood the silence was the answer. I said, "Who are you really?" He turned around. He looked at me with those gray-blue eyes, and I watched him make the decision to tell the truth the way I had watched my father make the decision to leave. Something settling, something closing. He said, "My name is Cole Whitfield. Raymond Whitfield is my father. I had spent 24 years learning not to show what I felt in the moment I felt it." I stepped back. I breathed. I looked at him. I said, "Say that again." He said it again. He told me the rest in a flat, steady voice. Left home 5 years ago. Took his mother's maiden name. Had not spoken to his father in 3 years. His father had sent him to Redemption Creek weeks before the fire, to assess the Callaway land, identify the family's vulnerabilities, build trust with the eldest daughter if possible. I said, "And the fire." Cole said, "I was watching the property. I saw 2 of Douglas Hale's men approach the house with lanterns. I saw them start it deliberately." He paused. "I was on that road because I was doing my father's work. I went into that house because 4 people were going to die, and I could not stand on a hillside and watch it happen. I heard this. I filed it. I was not ready to use it. I said, 'You came here with a map of my land and my enemy's name and let me offer you supper and a place to sleep.' He said, 'Yes.' I said, 'Get out.' He looked at me for one more moment. Then he went to the barn and saddled the black horse and came back out, leading it by the reins. Thomas ran out from somewhere and grabbed Cole's sleeve and started crying, without understanding why. Ruth stood on the porch with an expression too old for her face. May slipped a piece of paper into Cole's hand as he passed. I saw her do it, but didn't stop her. Cole paused at the gate. He didn't look back at me. He said, "Watch Douglas Hale, Eliza. He is not what he looks like. He never has been." I said, "Neither were you." He rode out. The dust settled. The yard felt different without him in it. Not emptier exactly, but differently weighted, the way a room feels after furniture has been moved, and you keep expecting something to be where it no longer is. I went inside and sat at the table with the map. The north section, the red circle. What is there that my father never told me about? A knock at the door just after dark. Douglas Hale with flowers and a performance of concern. He said, "I heard you had some trouble with your hired man. I wanted to make sure you were safe." He already knew Cole was gone. He knew it too quickly. I took the flowers. I thanked him. I closed the door. Douglas came back the next morning with something other than flowers. He sat at my kitchen table. I had made the mistake of letting him in, which I corrected by remaining standing, and presented his proposal with the smoothness of a man who has rehearsed it and believes the audience has no other options. He said, "Marry me. My father clears the debt. Your family keeps the land." It is a practical arrangement, Eliza. Sentiment is a luxury neither of us can afford right now. I said no. He said, "You have 53 days. The offer is considerably more time-limited than the deadline." He left smiling. I hated that he left smiling. I went to see Bernard Holt, the town's single attorney, and asked him to re-examine the debt note for irregularities. Bernard was evasive in a way that confirmed there was something to find. I noted this and went to find Fletcher. Fletcher was a mining surveyor who had been drinking himself quietly toward the edge of town for 6 years, ever since some venture had gone badly and left him with nothing to do with his knowledge. I brought him decent whiskey and 3 specific questions about mineral formations in the north section of my land. His hands stopped shaking long enough to answer me. He said, "Silver-bearing quartz formations. Real. Significant. The kind of find that changes a family for 3 generations." I said, "How long have you known this?" Fletcher looked at his glass. He said, "Your father asked me the same questions about 4 years ago." I sat with that for a moment. Then I went to see Sheriff Cooper. I asked him directly, had the men who started the fire at the Calloway homestead ever been identified? Cooper shifted in his chair and looked somewhere past my left shoulder. He said, "2 hired hands known to work Douglas Hale's operation were seen on that road that evening. No formal investigation was opened. The fire was ruled accidental." I said, "Ruled by whom?" Cooper said nothing, which was its own answer. The fire had not been misfortune. It had been the opening move. Douglas had burned my house to frighten us into accepting his proposal. Whitfield had stood behind him and called it business. And the sheriff who was supposed to protect this county had looked the other way because Raymond Whitfield owned enough of Redemption Creek that looking away had become a kind of reflex. I rode home past the boarding house, and I did not look up at the windows. Maggie found me the next day. She said, "That man of yours is still here." I said, "He is not my man." She said, "He is staying at my boarding house and paying his own way and spending his evenings at the table downstairs going through legal documents and survey maps." She paused. "He is not doing his father's work, Eliza. I know what that looks like. This is something else." I said, "How would you know what his father's work looks like?" Maggie looked at me steadily. She said, "Because my husband kept the books for Raymond Whitfield for 11 years before he died. And I know things about that man's business that would make your hair go white." She said it simply, without drama, the way a person states a fact they have been sitting on for a long time. I filed it. I went to the bookstore. Cole was there. I had not planned to speak to him, and I did not plan to forgive him, and I had a list of reasons why none of this was acceptable. And then he looked up from the shelf, and the 12 feet between us felt like a complicated distance. We didn't speak. He bought me the book again. A different one this time. A slim volume of geography that Ruth had mentioned wanting. He left it on the counter and walked out without explanation. Inside the front cover, no conditions attached to this one either. I stood in the bookstore for a moment with the book in my hands. Then I put it in my bag and went home. That evening, Whitfield himself came to the property for the first time. He walked the land with the eyes of a man cataloging what will soon be his, and he was scrupulously, dangerously polite. He looked at the north rise with a hunger he didn't bother to fully conceal. He said, "Lovely piece of ground, Miss Calloway. It would be a shame to watch it change hands under difficult circumstances." I said, "Then I suggest you prepare yourself for disappointment, Mr. Whitfield." He smiled at me the way large, patient things smile. He tipped his hat. He left. I stood in the yard after his buggy disappeared down the road, and I felt the shape of what I was up against more clearly than I ever had before. Ruth told me on a Monday morning, in the flat, direct way Ruth tells things. She said, May has been leaving the property on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, always south, always alone, always back before supper, with a specific, careful expression. I followed her on Thursday. May met Douglas Hale at the Cottonwood Grove by the South Creek. They stood close together in the shade. And Douglas was telling her something that made her face go soft in a way I recognized. It was the face she made when she was given something she had been hungry for and hadn't known how to ask for. I went home and waited. When May came in that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table. I said her name. She stopped in the doorway, and I watched the careful expression dissolve. She broke in under 2 minutes, not because she was weak, but because she had been carrying it alone and the weight had become too much. Douglas had approached her 3 weeks prior. He had told her that Eliza was being proud and foolish. He had told her that he had always felt more for May specifically, that if May could help him understand the family situation, the land, the debt, the man who had been working for us, he could help everyone come through this intact. May said, he asked about Cole, about the map Ruth found, about why you were interested in the north section. She looked at the table. She said, he said he loved me, Eliza. I did not say what I wanted to say. I looked at my 17-year-old sister and I thought about what it means to be starved for tenderness in the middle of 2 years of survival. And I understood exactly how Douglas had found the door. I said, he used you because you were the door he could open. That is not your fault. But I need you to see what he is. May nodded. Her eyes were red, but her chin was steady. I said, I need you to do something for me now. Every time Douglas Hale comes near this property, I need you to write it down. Date, time, direction he came from. Keep it under the floorboard in our room, she said. Like a record. I said, exactly like a record. That night the North Hay barn caught fire. Not accidental. Someone with purpose and a lit brand sometime after midnight. I smelled it before I saw it. Woke from a dead sleep with smoke in my nose and was out the door in my boots before I was fully awake. Cole arrived inside 20 minutes. He came off reckoning without slowing the horse to a full stop, and he was at the water trough with buckets before I had processed the fact that he was there. We worked side by side in the dark and the heat for 2 hours without speaking. When the fire was out, we were both standing in the ash with blistered hands, and neither of us moved away first. The siblings had watched from a distance and then gone inside. The yard was quiet. I said, why did you come back? Cole said, because it was your barn. I said, that is not a sufficient answer. He said, it's the only one I have right now. I looked at him in the dark and the ash and I said, I still don't trust you. He said, I know that. I said, then why are you still here? He said, because knowing it doesn't change where I need to be. We stood there for another moment. Then I said, there's something you need to tell me. He looked at me. I said, you were watching the property the night the house burned. You said you saw Douglas's men start it. Why were they there, Cole? Who sent them? Cole said, Douglas ordered it, to panic your family into accepting his proposal before you had time to find another option. He paused. My father knew about it afterward. He didn't order it, but he didn't stop it either. I heard this. I felt it settle into the growing shape of what I was dealing with. I said, go back to town. Come back in the morning. We need to talk about what happens next. He nodded. He got back on his horse. I stood in the burned yard and thought about a man who rides toward fires that aren't his problem. The letter from the Texas General Land Office arrived on a Friday. I had written to them 2 weeks prior requesting original survey records for the Callaway property. I spread them on Bernard Holt's desk alongside the current debt documentation and watched Bernard study them with the careful expression of a man who has known something uncomfortable for a while and has been waiting to be asked directly. I said, Mr. Holt, what are you not telling me? Bernard opened his desk drawer. He took out a sealed envelope. My father's handwriting on the front. My name. He said, James Calloway left this with me before he went. He said I was only to give it to you if you came asking hard questions. I took the envelope. Bernard stepped out. I sat alone in the office and opened it. My father's handwriting inside, the careful, methodical hand I knew from the ledger entries, covered 2 pages. He had found the silver 4 years ago. He hadn't had the capital to develop it. Whitfield had approached him with a loan offer that appeared standard. My father had signed without adequate counsel. He discovered the trap in the fine print only afterward. An accelerated default clause buried in language designed to be misunderstood. He had tried to find a way out. When he couldn't, he ran. The last paragraph. The silver is real, Eliza. It is worth more than the debt. It is worth fighting for. I was not the man who could fight for it. I hope to God you are. I think you always were. I folded the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I sat for a moment with my hands flat on the desk, and I thought about my father, who had loved us in his way and failed us in a way that was much larger. And I thought about what it means to understand completely why a person did something and still not be able to forgive it. Cole was outside when I came out. He fell into step beside me without a word. We walked to the creek at the edge of town, not because either of us planned it, but because it was where we ended up. And I sat on a flat rock and looked at the water for 5 minutes before I could talk. Then I told him everything. The letter, the silver, the trap my father had walked into and left us standing in. Cole listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, My father knew about the silver before yours did. He's been positioning for it for years. The loan wasn't generosity. It was acquisition with a longer timeline. I said, How long have you known that? He said, Eliza. I said, How long? He said, Since before I came here. I knew what the assignment was. I knew what the North section represented. I came here as my father's instrument, and I tried to do his work. And the night I watched 2 men set your house on fire, something changed that I have not been able to change back. I looked at him. At this man who had come to my land as my enemy's instrument and had run into a burning house and had left a book on a counter with no conditions attached and had ridden 20 minutes in the night because it was my barn. I said, What changed? He said, I did. We sat at the creek for a long time after that. The next morning, I was at the kitchen table with 3 failed attempts at a letter to my father in front of me. Crumpled, abandoned, words that wouldn't arrange themselves correctly. Cole appeared in the doorway. He read the situation in one look. He went to the shelf, took out a fresh sheet of paper, set it on the table beside a pen, and walked back out to work. No words, no performance of understanding. Just the paper. I picked up the pen and wrote the letter I had needed to write for 4 years. I did not know whether I would ever send it, but I wrote it, and something that had been held very tight in my chest for a long time released a little, like a knot worked loose. That evening on the porch, Cole told me the rest of what his father planned. The full scope, the legal preparation, the timeline. By the time he finished, the stars were out. I said, Why are you telling me this? He said, Because you deserve to be fighting something you can see. I looked at him in the dark. I said, Cole, what are you going to do? He said, Whatever you'll let me do. That's the only answer I have. Whitfield moved first on a Tuesday afternoon. I was riding home from town alone, late in the day, the light going amber and long, when his buggy pulled across the road ahead of me. 2 hired men flanked it. Whitfield himself sat inside, perfectly composed, as though he had simply happened to be passing. He said, I simply wanted to ensure you arrived home safely, Miss Calloway. These roads can be treacherous for a woman traveling alone. He looked at my saddlebag, at my hands on the reins, at my face with the unhurried attention of a man who is measuring how much longer this will take. He said, I hope you're not exhausting yourself with inquiries that have no productive conclusion. You have so many people depending on your strength. He tipped his hat. The buggy moved aside. I rode home without looking back. My hands did not shake until I was through the gate. Cole was in the yard. He saw my face. He said, "What happened?" I told him. He went very still in the way he went still when something inside him was moving fast. Then he said, "He won't do that again." I said, "You can't promise that." He said, "No, but I can make it considerably less convenient for him." That evening, he sat down across from me at the kitchen table and he said, "I need to tell you the rest of it. All of it." I said, "All right." He told me the complete truth this time. He had come to Redemption Creek 3 days before the fire. His father's instructions had been specific: assess the land's hidden value, identify the family's vulnerabilities, establish trust with the eldest daughter if possible, report back with a recommendation for timing the final legal move. He had been watching the property for 3 days. He had seen Douglas's men approach the house with lanterns on a Thursday evening, and he had watched them start the fire, and he had stayed on his hillside for approximately 10 seconds before he was on horseback and riding toward it. I said, "You came here to befriend me as a tactical operation." He said, "Yes," I said. "And the fire changed that." He said, "Yes." I said, "Just like that." He said, "Not just like that. Nothing about it was simple. But yes." I stood up. I said, "How convenient that your conscience found you at the exact moment it became inconvenient to continue." He said, "Eliza." I said, "I need you to leave tonight. I cannot look at you right now." He left. I sat at the table with the letter from my father and the map and the survey records and the debt notice, and I understood that I was surrounded on all sides by men who had made decisions about my family's land and my family's life without once consulting any member of my family, and the rage was so clean and complete that it almost felt like clarity. 3 days passed. Cole did not come to the property. I threw myself into work with the focused intensity of a woman who has learned that movement is the only reliable medicine for certain kinds of pain. Thomas set an extra plate at supper on the first night without realizing it. Ruth corrected him. Nobody said anything. May brought me her journal on the second evening. 12 careful entries, dates and times, and approach directions, documenting Douglas Hale's movements near the property. She handed it to me without asking for thanks and went back to the kitchen. I thought, that is who she is when someone lets her be. On the third morning, Sheriff Cooper arrived with a formal notice. Whitfield was invoking the accelerated default clause 40 days ahead of the deadline. His stated grounds: the destruction of the North Hay barn constituted material damage to secured property, the barn that Douglas's men had burned. Cooper read the notice without meeting my eyes. He handed it to me. He turned to leave. I said, "Sheriff." He stopped. I said, "He burned it, and you know he burned it." Cooper said nothing. He rode away. He did not look back. 7 days. That night, alone in the house after the children were in bed, I spread everything I had on the kitchen table and looked at it. The original survey records, my father's letter, the debt note, May's journal, the map Cole had been carrying. I thought about what Maggie had said. My husband kept the books for Raymond Whitfield for 11 years, and I know things about that man's business. I thought about my father's letter, Whitfield note extended, terms to be discussed. I thought about the W on Cole's shoulder, worked over with scar tissue, the deliberate erasure of a name. I thought about a man who had come here to do his father's work and had gone into a burning house instead. I sat at that table until 3 in the morning. Then I blew out the lamp and went to bed and made a decision. I rode to the boarding house at first light. Maggie opened the door before I knocked. She stepped aside without a word and pointed at the stairs. Cole was at the table in the small sitting room at the end of the hall with coffee and an organized spread of documents that told me he had not slept. He looked up when I came in. I said, "I don't trust you yet. I want to be honest about that." He waited. I said, "But I trust you more than I trust anyone else who is positioned to help. And right now, that has to be enough." He pulled out the chair across from him. I sat down and told him about the connection I had made. My father's reference to Dunmore in the margin of his personal copy of the debt paperwork. A name, a question mark, and the knowledge that Maggie's husband had kept Whitfield's books. Cole said, "You think Maggie has something." I said, "I think Maggie has been waiting for someone to ask the right question." We went downstairs together. Maggie looked at us across her kitchen and set down her coffee cup and went to the back room without being asked. She came back with a locked metal strongbox and set it on the table. She said, "My husband had a policy. Keep copies of everything. A man who works for Raymond Whitfield accumulates insurance, or he accumulates regret." She opened it. Inside was the original Callaway debt note, James Callaway's signature at the bottom. Standard terms. No accelerated default clause. No buried penalty language. Clean and straightforward and completely different from the document Whitfield had been using in his legal proceedings. I looked at it for a long time. I said, "He altered it." Maggie said, "After your father signed, and before the ink was recorded anywhere official, my husband suspected it but couldn't prove it without showing his own copies, which would have cost him his position." We brought both documents to Bernard Holt within the hour. He laid them side by side on his desk and studied them for 10 minutes while none of us spoke. He said, "The typeface on the amended section is from a different press than the rest of the document. The paper stock in the final clause doesn't match. This is forgery, Miss Callaway. It is a felony under Texas law." I said, "Can we use it?" He said, "With the right witness in the right place at the right time." "Yes." Cole said, "I'll be the witness." I looked at him. He said, "My father sent me here. If I walk into that office, he'll believe I've come back to the family enterprise. He'll want to believe it. 5 years, and he'll want to believe it badly enough to talk." He said it simply, like a man describing weather. He'll explain everything. He always does when he thinks he's winning. I said, "And if something goes wrong," Cole said, "then you have the documents and you win without me." He said his own safety as though it were simply not the primary variable. I rode to the sheriff's office alone. Cooper was at his desk. I put both documents in front of him, the original and the forgery, and I waited. He looked at them for a long time. He looked at his badge. He looked out the window at the street he had been policing on Raymond Whitfield's behalf for 11 years. He said, "If I walk into that office, there's no coming back from it." I said, "No, there isn't. But there's a version of you that still exists. Whether you want to be that man is the only question that matters right now." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up. Cole walked into Whitfield's office as though 5 years had not passed. I know what happened inside because Cole told me later, and because Maggie, who had positioned herself outside the window under the pretext of sweeping the boardwalk, heard enough to fill in the rest. Whitfield's face moved through shock and recovery in under 3 seconds. His son had come back. He had always known his son would come back. He was too controlled to show joy openly, but it showed anyway, briefly in his eyes. Cole performed the return of the prodigal. He mentioned the Callaway situation with careful casualness. Whitfield, relieved, expansive, already rewriting the story with his son restored to it, explained everything. The forgery rationale, the silver's true value, the plan with Douglas, the manufactured fire, the legal strategy. He explained it all to his son, his returned son, who was not there for the reason he thought. Cooper came through the door at precisely the moment Whitfield finished the sentence that ended him. Douglas, when word reached him, tried to leave through the back of the hotel. He found May standing in the alley with her journal and 2 of the Patterson brothers as witnesses. She didn't move to stop him physically. She simply stood there holding the journal. She said, "I wrote it all down. He was arrested 50 feet later. I was not in town for any of it. I was standing in the north pasture, in the middle of the ground that had started everything, looking at the dirt that held silver beneath it and the sky above it, and I was thinking about my father's letter, and about the weight of what I had been carrying for 4 years, and about what it feels like when something you have been braced against finally releases. I heard hoofbeats behind me. I did not turn around. I already knew the sound." Cole stopped reckoning at the fence line. The horse dropped his head and blew a long breath. I heard Cole dismount, his boots on the dry ground coming toward me. He stopped a few feet away and stood beside me in the silence. I said, "Is it done?" He said, "It's done." I said, "Your father?" He said, "Is in custody, along with Douglas." I looked out at the north section, the rocky rise, the silver underneath, the sky over everything. I said, "Cole." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Thank you." He said, "You did most of it." I said, "Not the part in that office." He was quiet. Then he said, "That part I needed to do for myself, not just for you." I understood that. I had needed to write that letter to my father for myself, not just to release the pressure of it. We stood there in the November light for a while. The debt note was voided the following week. Bernard Holt stood in the county courthouse and presented both documents to the judge with the calm precision of a man who has been waiting for this particular moment and intends to do it justice. The forgery was clear, the original terms were clear, the land was free of encumbrance. Raymond Whitfield faced criminal forgery charges. His assets were frozen pending investigation. Douglas Hale faced charges related to arson and criminal conspiracy. Sheriff Cooper, who had walked into that office and done the thing that cost him everything and saved what was left of him, submitted his resignation the same day and was quietly asked by the new acting sheriff to stay on in an advisory capacity, which he accepted without ceremony. I stood outside the courthouse in the cold morning air and breathed. Bernard came out and stood beside me. He said, "You could pursue civil damages." I said, "I just want my land." He said, "You have it." I walked to my horse and rode home. Cole was in the north pasture when I arrived. He was sitting on the top rail of the north fence, looking out at the rise where the silver ran underground. 2 cups of coffee. He had left one on the fence post for me. I climbed up beside him. We drank coffee and looked at the land in the quiet way of people who have been through something together and no longer need to perform composure at each other. He said, after a while, "I have savings. Enough to develop the silver claim properly with the right equipment and the right crew. If you'd consider a partner." I said, "A business partner." He said, "Among other things, if you consider that too." I said, "Cole McAllister." He said, "You can call me Whitfield if you prefer. I've been thinking it's time to stop running from the name." I said, "Are you proposing a commercial arrangement or are you courting me?" He said, "Both, in whatever order you prefer." I looked at him, at this man who had come here as my enemy's instrument, and had run into a burning house and written notes in the front covers of books and stood outside my window on the night. He could have ridden away and chosen, for reasons I believe now were real, to stay. I said, "I need you to understand something first." He waited. I said, "My father left because staying was hard. Douglas performed love like a stage production and used it as a tool. I have a very low tolerance remaining for men who are something other than what they present themselves to be." Cole said, "I came here as my father's instrument. I am choosing for the rest of my time in this world to be something else. Those are not the same person. I know I have to show you that over time. I'm not asking you to take it on faith." I said, "I know." He said, "You do." I said, "I've been watching the second person for long enough to know the difference. I was the one who moved first. I had been independent since I was 16, and I was not looking for rescue. And I wanted him to understand that what I was choosing was not relief or gratitude or the exhaustion of having no other option. It was completely voluntary. It was the most frightening thing I had chosen in my life, because it was entirely mine to choose." I said, "I've never needed anyone to save me." He said, "Good, because I'm not offering that. I'm offering to be here for as long as you'll have me." I said, "Then yes." The first real kiss, unhurried, on the north fence of my family's land, with the cold air around us and the silver underground and the sky very blue overhead. I had chosen it. That was the part I would always remember. 1 year later, on a morning in November, I stood on the porch with my coffee and watched the shape of my life laid out in the early light. Thomas was running across the south field toward Cole, who was repairing the fence line with 2 hired hands. Cole lifted the boy onto his shoulders without breaking stride. Thomas's laugh carried all the way to the house, that specific high, unguarded laugh of a child who has been made to feel completely safe. Ruth passed through the yard in her good coat, a stack of books under her arm, heading for the wagon that would take her to the Austin stage. She had been awarded a place at the women's college in the city through a scholarship that Cole had quietly arranged and told no one about until after it was confirmed. She paused at the porch step and looked at me for a moment with that particular Ruth expression, 5% sentimental, 95% practical, and then nodded once and got in the wagon. May was leading a group of children into the new schoolroom addition built against the east side of the house. 12 students, 3 mornings a week, reading from books I had been collecting for 2 years. May taught alongside me now. She had a gift for the younger ones, a patience and a gentleness that I suspected had always been there, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. She caught my eye across the yard and gave me a small private smile. The smile of a person who has found what they are actually for. Maggie was in the chair at the far end of the porch. I had built it to her specific dimensions, at her preferred angle to the morning sun, after she'd made an offhand comment once about never having had a chair that fit correctly. She had not mentioned the chair since. She came 3 mornings a week, and sat in it and read and drank coffee, and occasionally said something so precise about the nature of people that I had to write it down. The silver operation was running. We had brought in a proper crew and the right equipment, and the first extraction had confirmed what Fletcher's shaking hands had told me a year ago. It was enough. More than enough. Enough to rebuild the house properly, expand the herd, fund the school, and still have what a family needed to feel secure in the world. The land my father had lost his courage over. The land Raymond Whitfield had forged documents to take. The land that Douglas Hale had burned a barn to frighten me off of. Still ours. More ours than it had ever been. Cole looked up from the fence line. Across the distance and the cold air and the sound of the children and the horses, he found my eyes. He smiled. The slow, certain one. The one that had taken me longer than I would ever admit to stop being afraid of. I smiled back. He lifted Thomas off his shoulders and set the boy running toward the house and started walking toward the porch himself. I set down my coffee cup. I used to watch the horizon. I grew up watching it, waiting for whatever was coming, because in my experience, what came from that direction was usually loss. My father walking away in the dark, a debt I hadn't made, a fire I hadn't started, a map in a stranger's saddlebag with my land circled in red. I don't watch the horizon anymore. I have no need of it. Everything I want is inside this fence line. Cole is at the porch steps now. Thomas is ahead of him, already calling for May, already moving on to the next thing the way children do. Cole puts one hand on the porch rail and looks up at me with those gray-blue eyes that I have learned over a year of mornings to read as well as I read weather. He says, "Good morning." I say, "Good morning." He comes up the steps. He takes my coffee cup and drinks from it without asking, the way he has been doing for 8 months, and hands it back. He looks out at the yard, at Ruth's wagon disappearing down the road, at May's children spilling out of the schoolroom door for their break, at Maggie turning a page without looking up. He says, "Not bad." I say, "No, not bad at all. Home is not a piece of ground. I have fought for a piece of ground, and I am glad I fought for it, and it is mine. But that is not what I mean. Home is a choice, made again every morning, by both people." He is standing next to me on the porch of the house we built together, on the land we saved together, in the life that started on a Thursday evening when everything I owned turned to ash, and a stranger rode out of the dark and chose without hesitation to ride toward the fire. I reach over and take his hand. He holds on.
From the story of Eliza Calloway and the burning of her home, a deeper meaning emerges that reflects not only the harsh realities of life in the American frontier, but also the enduring strength of character, truth, and moral choice. As a writer seasoned in tales of the West, I would say this story is not merely about land, fire, or survival. It is about seeing clearly in a world built on deception and choosing who we become when circumstances test us. First, the story speaks powerfully about resilience in the face of loss. Eliza loses her home, her sense of security, and nearly her land, the very foundation of her family's identity. Yet she does not surrender. Instead, she steps into responsibility not because she is ready, but because she must be. This reflects a central truth of frontier life. Strength is often born not from comfort, but from necessity. The moral lesson here is clear. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Second, the story explores the theme of truth versus appearance. Many characters present themselves as something they are not. Douglas Hale disguises greed as love. Raymond Whitfield masks exploitation as business. Even Cole arrives under false pretenses. Yet over time, truth reveals itself not through words, but through actions. Cole risks his life to save Eliza's family, returns when he could leave, and ultimately stands against his own father. The lesson here is profound. A person is not defined by what they claim to be, but by what they choose to do when it matters most. Another important moral lies in the idea of moral transformation. Cole's journey is especially significant. He begins as an instrument of injustice, sent to exploit a vulnerable family. But witnessing wrongdoing and choosing not to be part of it changes him. His transformation reminds us that no one is bound forever by their past or their origins. Redemption is possible, but it requires sacrifice, honesty, and consistent action. The story also highlights the danger of power without integrity. Whitfield represents a system where wealth and influence corrupt justice. The law is bent, truth is buried, and the weak are targeted. Yet the story ultimately shows that such power is fragile. When courage, evidence, and integrity come together, even the strongest corrupt system can fall. The lesson is that justice may be delayed, but it is not unreachable when people are willing to stand for it. Equally important is the theme of trust and choice. Eliza does not blindly trust Cole after learning the truth. Her trust is rebuilt slowly, through observation and evidence. This is realistic and meaningful. Trust, the story tells us, is not given, it is earned. And love, in the end, is not about dependency or rescue. It is about two people choosing each other freely, with full understanding of who they are. Finally, the story teaches us something deeply human about the meaning of home. At the beginning, home is a physical place, land, house, inheritance. But by the end, Eliza understands that home is something more. It is built from trust, shared struggle, and the daily choice to stand together. In conclusion, this story offers a rich moral landscape. Stand strong in adversity. Judge people by their actions, not their words. Believe in the possibility of change. Resist injustice, even when it seems powerful. And understand that true belonging is something we build, not something we inherit. Like many great Western tales, it reminds us that the harshest landscapes often produce the clearest truths, and that in the fire of hardship, a person's true character is revealed.